It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Derek Thompson entered the municipal courthouse. Dressed in a tailored gray suit with a crisp white shirt and a modest blue tie, he looked every bit the professional. He carried himself with an air of calm confidence, though there was an unmistakable weariness in his eyes. This was not the first time he had experienced the subtle and sometimes overt biases of the world, and he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. Derek's presence in the courthouse that day stemmed from what should have been a minor incident, a traffic violation. He had been pulled over a week earlier for allegedly running a stop sign, though he was certain he had stopped fully. Despite explaining this calmly to the officer, he was issued a ticket, along with a glare that left little doubt in Derek's mind about the officer's prejudices. Still, he decided to fight the citation not because of the fine itself, but because he believed in standing up for what was right. As Derek walked into the courtroom, he noticed the judge sitting at the elevated bench. Judge Raymond Parker was a man in his late 50s with a stern face and an imposing presence. His reputation preceded him, a no-nonsense judge who was known for being particularly harsh on defendants who didn't fit his narrow view of respectability. Parker had served on the bench for decades, and though there were murmurs about his biased rulings, nothing had ever come of it. The courtroom was sparsely filled that morning, with a handful of people waiting for their cases to be heard. Derek took a seat near the front, patiently watching as the judge called one case after another. It didn't take long for him to notice a pattern. Defendants who looked like him, black and brown men and women, seemed to receive harsher judgments than their white counterparts. A young Hispanic woman who had failed to pay a parking ticket was reprimanded for her irresponsibility, while a white man with a more serious offense was let off with a mild warning. When Derek's name was called, he stood, adjusted his tie, and approached the bench. The judge barely glanced at him before rolling his eyes. "Derek Thompson," Judge Parker said, his voice dripping with impatience. "You're here contesting a traffic violation?" "Yes, Your Honor," Derek replied calmly. The judge leaned back in his chair, looking Derek up and down with thinly veiled disdain. "Let me guess," he said, smirking. "You think the officer who gave you the ticket was wrong?" Derek maintained his composure. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe there was a misunderstanding. I came to a complete stop at the sign, but—" Parker raised a hand, cutting him off. "Of course you did," he said sarcastically. "Because nobody ever thinks they're at fault when they're pulled over, right?" The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scribbling of the court stenographer. Derek could feel the eyes of the other attendees on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent. He took a deep breath. "Your Honor," he began, "I understand that officers have a difficult job, and I respect the work they do. However, in this case, I believe there was an error, and I'd like the opportunity to explain my perspective." The judge let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You people always have an excuse," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Derek and others to hear. Derek's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. He knew better than to let anger show. Instead, he focused on the facts. "Your Honor, I have dashcam footage from my car that shows I stopped fully at the sign. I believe it will demonstrate that the officer's observation was incorrect." Parker frowned, clearly annoyed. "Dashcam footage?" he repeated. "So now everyone thinks they're a lawyer because they have a camera in their car." He waved a dismissive hand. "I don't have time to watch your little video. This is a courtroom, not a movie theater." The comment drew a few chuckles from the gallery, though most people remained quiet, sensing the tension in the room. Derek remained composed. "Your Honor, I believe the footage is relevant evidence that should be considered," he said firmly. The judge glared at him. "Mr. Thompson, do you know how many cases I see every day? You think your little traffic ticket is more important than the real issues we deal with in this courtroom?" "I'm not suggesting that, Your Honor," Derek replied. "I'm simply asking for a fair review of the facts." Parker's expression darkened. "Fair review?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You're wasting this court's time, and frankly, I'm tired of your attitude. The fine stands plus court fees. That's $500. There was an audible gasp from some in the courtroom. The fine was exorbitant for a minor traffic violation, and the addition of court fees felt punitive. Derek stood silently for a moment, processing the judge's words. He could feel the heat of injustice burning in his chest, but he refused to let it show. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said finally, his voice steady. "May I request a follow-up hearing to address legal concerns regarding this ruling?" Parker narrowed his eyes. "Follow-up hearing? What legal concerns could you possibly have?" "That will be for the next hearing to determine, Your Honor," Derek said evenly. The judge seemed taken aback by Derek's calmness. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Fine," he said curtly. "You'll get your hearing, but don't expect any sympathy from this court." Derek nodded politely and turned to leave, his footsteps measured and deliberate. As he walked past the gallery, he could feel the weight of their stares. Some looked at him with pity, others with admiration for how he had handled himself. Outside the courtroom, Derek stood on the courthouse steps and took a deep breath. He wasn't surprised by what had happened, but it still stung. He thought about the judge's dismissive remarks, the way he had been belittled simply for asking for fairness. But Derek wasn't one to back down. As he walked away, a small smile played on his lips. The judge didn't know who he was, not really. And in the next hearing, he would make sure Judge Parker understood exactly who he had underestimated. The days leading up to Derek's follow-up hearing were filled with quiet determination. He spent hours preparing, combing through legal precedents, and consulting with a small but trusted group of colleagues. What Judge Parker had no way of knowing was that Derek Thompson wasn't just another man contesting a traffic violation. He was a seasoned federal prosecutor with years of experience navigating the complexities of the legal system. Derek had argued cases that shaped communities and policies, but his humility kept his identity from being immediately apparent to most. After the first hearing, Derek's colleagues were outraged upon hearing how he had been treated. "This isn't just about a traffic ticket," one of them said. "It's about accountability. Judges like Parker think they can get away with blatant bias because no one challenges them. You have to do this, Derek." Derek nodded. "I will, but I won't make this personal. It's about the principle, not my ego." Meanwhile, Judge Parker went about his days oblivious to the storm brewing around him. To him, Derek was just another name in a long list of defendants he'd dismissed. His courtroom demeanor had earned him a reputation for being harsh, but many in the legal community had quietly criticized his clear bias, particularly against people of color and those from underprivileged backgrounds. Despite murmurs of discontent, no formal complaints had ever been filed. The day of the follow-up hearing arrived. The courtroom was fuller than usual, as news of the previous encounter had spread. Some local legal professionals and community members had come to observe, curious about what Derek planned to do. Derek entered the courtroom, his demeanor calm and focused. He carried a leather briefcase, its contents meticulously organized. As he approached the bench, he noticed Judge Parker glance at him with a smirk, as if amused by his persistence. "Back again, Mr. Thompson?" the judge said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, Your Honor," Derek replied evenly. The proceedings began with Derek presenting the dashcam footage he had referenced in the first hearing. This time, Parker couldn't avoid viewing it, as Derek had filed a formal motion for evidence review. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played on a large monitor. It clearly showed Derek coming to a complete stop at the sign before proceeding. Judge Parker's face tightened, but he remained silent for a moment, clearly irritated. "Well, it seems you did stop," he said reluctantly. "But that doesn't change the fact that you were issued a citation by a sworn officer of the law." Derek nodded. "I understand that, Your Honor. However, the footage directly contradicts the officer's claim, and I believe it demonstrates a pattern of improper enforcement." Parker scoffed. "A pattern? Are you implying this officer deliberately targeted you?" "I'm implying that bias in enforcement is a concern worth addressing," Derek replied. "And not just from officers. It's a concern at every level of the system." The tension in the room was palpable. Derek's words were measured but pointed, and Parker was visibly uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, his usual air of authority faltering slightly. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said sharply, "this is a simple traffic case. You're turning it into something it's not." "With respect, Your Honor," Derek replied, "this case is a microcosm of larger issues. It's about fairness, justice, and accountability. And as a member of the legal profession, I believe it's my duty to address these issues, no matter how small they may seem." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Member of the legal profession? Are you a paralegal, Mr. Thompson? Or perhaps a law student?" Derek allowed a small smile to creep onto his face. "Actually, Your Honor, I'm a federal prosecutor." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Derek's calm revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Judge Parker's expression shifted from smugness to disbelief, and then to discomfort. "A prosecutor?" Parker said, his voice faltering slightly. "Why didn't you disclose that before?" "With respect, Your Honor, my profession shouldn't affect the fairness of this proceeding," Derek said. "I wanted to be judged as any other citizen would be, without special treatment. Unfortunately, what I experienced was far from fair." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Several people nodded in agreement, while others exchanged astonished glances. Parker's reputation was finally being called into question in a public forum. "I see," the judge said, struggling to regain his composure. "Well, Mr. Thompson, if you felt this court was unfair, you should have raised your concerns through the proper channels." Derek nodded. "I intend to, Your Honor. In fact, I've already filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board regarding this case and your conduct." The room fell silent again. Parker's face turned red, his frustration and embarrassment evident. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Derek continued, "It's not my intention to disrespect this court or your position, Your Honor, but I believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness, regardless of their background, profession, or the color of their skin. That's the standard we should all strive for." The judge clenched his jaw, his authority slipping further with every word Derek spoke. He hastily declared a recess, retreating to his chambers to compose himself. During the break, spectators in the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Many praised Derek for his courage, while others expressed outrage at the judge's behavior. Local reporters who had been tipped off about the case began taking notes, sensing a potential scandal brewing. When court resumed, Parker was noticeably more subdued. He announced that the fine and fees against Derek would be dropped, citing newly reviewed evidence. He avoided meeting Derek's eyes as he spoke. As the hearing concluded, Derek thanked the court and left the courtroom with his head held high. Outside, he was met with applause from some of the spectators who had gathered. A few reporters approached him, asking for comments, but Derek politely declined. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about ensuring that justice is truly blind and that everyone is treated equally under the law." As Derek walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He hadn't just cleared his name. He had taken a stand against injustice and set in motion a chain of events that could lead to real change. Unbeknownst to him, the fallout for Judge Parker was just beginning. Complaints from other defendants and legal professionals began to surface, and the Judicial Review Board launched a formal investigation into his conduct. Derek's actions had lit a spark, one that would shine a light on the biases and flaws within the system. The story of his courage and composure would serve as a powerful reminder that one person, armed with truth and conviction, could make a difference. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. By the time Derek Thompson's case resumed for the follow-up hearing, it was no longer a mundane traffic violation case. Word of the previous exchanges had spread like wildfire among the local legal community, drawing interest from attorneys, activists, and even members of the press. Spectators filled the benches, eager to witness what would unfold next. Judge Parker entered the room, his demeanor stiffer than before. Gone was the overconfidence he had exuded earlier. In its place was a strained attempt to maintain control. Derek, seated calmly at the defendant's table, appeared unfazed, his quiet composure commanding respect. "Court is now in session," the clerk announced, prompting everyone to rise. Judge Parker cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, I hope we can keep today's proceedings focused and efficient," he said, a thinly veiled attempt to reassert authority. "Of course, Your Honor," Derek replied politely. As the session began, Derek presented additional evidence, not only reinforcing his innocence but also shining a light on the broader implications of his case. Among his materials was a compilation of complaints filed by other defendants against the same officer who had issued his ticket, alleging similar instances of racial profiling and fabricated violations. "Your Honor," Derek began, "what I present today is not an isolated incident. My experience is part of a troubling pattern." The courtroom fell silent as Derek methodically laid out his case. He spoke not as a defendant but as a skilled litigator, carefully presenting facts, citing legal precedents, and connecting the dots between the evidence and systemic issues in law enforcement and judicial oversight. Judge Parker's unease grew palpable. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, visibly perturbed by the direction the hearing was taking. "Mr. Thompson," he interrupted, "this is still a traffic case. Let's not overcomplicate things." "With respect, Your Honor," Derek replied, his tone firm but respectful. "Justice demands thorough examination. This case has become bigger than a single ticket. It's about accountability." Parker's face darkened. "Are you questioning this court's integrity?" "I'm questioning its practices, Your Honor," Derek said evenly. "And I believe the public has a right to know." At that moment, Derek's calm but unrelenting approach reached a tipping point. A woman in the gallery, who had been watching intently, raised her hand. "Your Honor, I request permission to speak," she said. Judge Parker frowned. "This is highly irregular. Identify yourself." The woman stood. "My name is Lisa Grant. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I've been monitoring this case." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. "Ms. Grant," Parker said, his voice taut, "you have no standing in this case." "Perhaps not," she said, "but I represent several clients who filed formal complaints against this court and the officer involved in Mr. Thompson's case. I believe their voices are relevant." Derek turned toward Lisa, silently grateful for her support. Her presence added weight to his argument, underscoring that his case was not an isolated anomaly. Before Parker could respond, Derek rose. "Your Honor, may I introduce myself more formally?" Parker hesitated but gestured for him to continue. "My name is Derek Thompson," he began, his voice steady but resonant. "I am a federal prosecutor with over a decade of experience in criminal justice. I've dedicated my career to upholding the law and ensuring fairness for all. But in this courtroom, I experienced the same bias and injustice I've fought against my entire life." Gasps rippled through the room. The revelation was like a lightning strike, stunning everyone present. Parker's face turned a deep shade of red. His usual composure shattered. "You're a prosecutor?" Parker sputtered. "Yes, Your Honor," Derek replied, "and I chose not to disclose my position initially because I wanted to be treated as any ordinary citizen would be. Unfortunately, what I encountered was anything but ordinary." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a headline-worthy scandal in the making. Parker attempted to regain control. "Mr. Thompson, if you felt this court was biased, there are proper channels for addressing such concerns." "I'm aware, Your Honor," Derek said, "and I've already filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board. This hearing is simply the beginning." The tension in the room was electric. Parker's attempt to dismiss the case as trivial had backfired spectacularly, exposing not only his own bias but also the flaws in the system he represented. At that moment, a young man in the gallery stood up. "Your Honor, I have something to say too," he announced, his voice trembling but resolute. Parker glared at him. "This is highly irregular. It's about fairness," the man interrupted. "I was in this court last month for a similar case. The officer lied about what happened, but I didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. I ended up paying a fine I didn't deserve." The courtroom erupted in murmurs again. Parker banged his gavel, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. One by one, more spectators stood, sharing their own stories of injustice. It became clear that Derek's case was merely the tip of the iceberg. Lisa Grant seized the moment. "Your Honor, this courtroom is no longer just a place for individual cases. It's become a forum for accountability. And as members of the legal community, it's our duty to listen." Judge Parker's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. He banged his gavel repeatedly, finally managing to restore order. "This hearing is adjourned," he barked, retreating to his chambers without another word. As the courtroom emptied, Derek found himself surrounded by supporters. Strangers shook his hand, thanking him for standing up to injustice. Lisa Grant approached him, her eyes shining with admiration. "You've started something important, Derek," she said. "This isn't just about one case. It's about changing the system." Derek nodded. "It's a start," he said, "but there's a long way to go." Unbeknownst to him, the fallout from the day's revelations was already beginning. Parker's actions were under scrutiny, and the Judicial Review Board had opened a formal investigation. The stories shared in the courtroom were making headlines, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Derek's decision to challenge the system had not only cleared his name but also ignited a movement. It was a victory, not just for him, but for everyone who believed in the power of justice. The following weeks were a whirlwind of public attention, legal actions, and personal reflection. Derek Thompson's case had gone far beyond the walls of Judge Parker's courtroom, becoming a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice. News outlets picked up the story, recounting the dramatic revelation of Derek's identity as a federal prosecutor and the outpouring of grievances from citizens who had faced similar injustices. The morning after the hearing, Derek woke to find his phone inundated with messages, texts, emails, and social media notifications. Some were from friends and colleagues applauding his bravery. Others were from complete strangers, thanking him for speaking out. One email stood out. It was from a young woman named Camille, whose father had faced biased treatment in Parker's courtroom years earlier. "My dad didn't have the resources to fight back," she wrote. "He spent years living with a record that cost him jobs and dignity. Thank you for standing up when so many couldn't." The email left Derek both humbled and resolute. Camille's words reminded him of why he had pursued law in the first place. Not just to enforce it, but to ensure it served the people fairly. Judge Parker's troubles escalated quickly. The Judicial Review Board launched an investigation into his courtroom conduct, spurred by Derek's formal complaint and corroborated by testimonies from other defendants. Public outcry added pressure. Articles detailed Parker's history of dismissive and biased rulings, painting a damning picture of his career. When reporters approached Parker for a comment, he issued a terse statement denying any wrongdoing. "My record speaks for itself," he claimed, but his words rang hollow as more stories emerged. Meanwhile, Derek collaborated with Lisa Grant and other attorneys to build a case against systemic bias in the local judicial system. They held a press conference on the courthouse steps, where Derek spoke with conviction. "This isn't about one judge or one case. It's about ensuring that justice applies to everyone equally, regardless of their background or resources. We have a responsibility to hold the system accountable." The press conference went viral, further galvanizing public support. Activist groups organized rallies, and local officials faced mounting calls to reform the judicial process. Derek's initial traffic violation case was eventually brought before a different judge, one with a reputation for fairness. The evidence Derek presented dismantled the officer's claims, leading to a swift dismissal of the charges. But the hearing didn't end there. The new judge, aware of the case's broader implications, addressed the courtroom. "This situation highlights the importance of integrity in our legal system," she said. "We must hold ourselves to the highest standards, as the consequences of failing to do so are far-reaching." Her words resonated deeply with Derek, who felt a sense of closure. His name had been cleared, but more importantly, the system that had wronged him was being forced to confront its flaws. Weeks later, the Judicial Review Board announced its findings. Judge Parker had violated ethical standards by allowing bias to influence his rulings. He was suspended from the bench pending further disciplinary action. The decision sent shockwaves through the legal community. For some, it was a long overdue reckoning. For others, it was a wake-up call. Derek received countless messages from lawyers, judges, and law students inspired by his courage. Lisa Grant, who had become a close ally, summarized the sentiment best. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, Derek. You stood up for everyone who's been silenced or dismissed by a flawed system." Derek took her words to heart. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he was proud to have sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. On a quiet evening, Derek sat in his living room, reflecting on everything that had transpired. His wife joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've done something incredible," she said, "but I know it hasn't been easy." He nodded, thinking of the challenges he'd faced and the personal toll the case had taken. But he also thought of Camille's email, the people who had stood up in the courtroom, and the countless others who would benefit from the changes he had helped initiate. "It's worth it," he said. "If even one person doesn't have to go through what I did, it's worth it." His wife smiled. "Well, you're not done yet. There's still a lot of work to do." Derek knew she was right. The system wasn't perfect, and change wouldn't come overnight. But he was ready to keep fighting, not just as a prosecutor but as an advocate for justice. Derek's story serves as a powerful reminder that one person's courage can inspire change. If you've been moved by his journey, don't let it stop here. Share this story, spark conversations, and hold those in power accountable. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and justice. Together, we can shine a light on the issues that matter and work toward a fairer world. Thank you for watching.